no more, cause it's my time. I said it's my time. Listen, it's my time to take back what's mine. I'm snatching it from the devil's hand, cause I got a surpass the bad plan. Come on, let's take it home now. It's my time, yeah. Hey, it's my time, yeah. That's it. It's my time, yeah.
Greetings, everyone. I am Greg DeMyers Jr., founder and CEO of Gregory D Productions, and we are in collaboration with Events and Excellent Productions and Promotions and Citywide Revival 2020 Collective. And I want to thank everyone for attending this much needed community platform for change regarding racial unrest in 2020. We want to thank our moderator and all of today's panelists who will be sharing their hearts with us very shortly. Our event host for the evening will be Kim Milton Mackey and Reverend Yvonne Young. Once again, thank you for attending this community platform for change, and please enjoy. I now turn it over to Reverend Yvonne Young.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's my time. We are offering yet another It's My Time community forum, virtual forum. Isn't it amazing what we can do virtually? So welcome and thank you for coming and thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. We have a host of different panelists here who we are waiting to hear from. We're excited to hear from them. We want to know about education. We want, as it relates to race and diversity, we want to know about the court system. We want to know about what Senator Hartel's working on and State Rep, Sarah Anthony's working on. We want to know what's happening. So we're excited that you're here with us. Our purpose is just to learn those things. So stay tuned, stay with us, and just hang in there so you can learn something that you haven't learned before. Kim?
All right, thank you, Elder Greg DeMyers, and also Reverend Yvonne Young for the welcome and being here on today. I would like to thank our panelists, LCC Board of Trustee Ryan Buck, just right there you go. Also Michigan State Representative Sarah Anthony, Michigan State Senator Curtis Hartel Jr., and also Ingham County Prosecutor Carol Seaman for being on the front line of change. It is an honor for them to be here today. Some of them may have to log off a little early, but we do want to thank them for allowing us to be on a platform to where they can share the things that they are doing. Now, I want to get to the good part, and that is introducing the honored Dr. Paul Elam. He is our moderator on tonight. He is on the front line and has been on the front line for over 20 years. I want to share a little bit about him so that you all know who would be moderating on this evening. Dr. Paul Elam is a Chief Strategy Officer for MPHI, a Michigan-based and nationally engaged nonprofit public health institute. Paul is nationally recognized for his deep understanding of crime and justice, youth violence and prevention, and child maltreatment. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience measuring racial and ethnic disproportionately and believes that sound public policy analysis should include an examination of whether all people are being treated fairly and equitably. Dr. Elam is a member of the Center for Justice Research National Police Reform Advisory Board, I understand. That is a new group that was, you'll be hearing more about that a little bit later. He believes our legislators need the advice of criminal justice scholars with lived experiences growing up in communities where police oppression and brutality often occurs. Dr. Paul Elam.
Thank you for the introduction, Kim, and for the opportunity to join you, Yvonne, and this wonderful panel you've assembled, and our online viewers who are also sharing deep concern about this time and the critical conversations that we're having on racial injustice and the actions that are being taken by our elected officials to effect positive change. As the theme that indicates that you've selected today, I too believe it is time for us to get into good and necessary trouble. And there is no better example than the late Representative John Lewis, who demonstrated what this meant by his life's testimony. He said, when you see something that is not fair, not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Well, we've come tonight to do just that. We have to speak up. We have to make some noise because something isn't right today in our land. And so the responses to the current injustices we have all observed and experienced firsthand since March 2020 have varied during this time of unrest. We've seen statements issued by leaders and organizations, mandates for staff to participate in trainings on unconscious bias, removal of statues that honored and commemorated Confederate leaders, protests, riots, community organizing, and much debate. But tonight we want to come to talk about the enactment of legislation and policy that calls for the elimination of individual, institutional, and systemic racism. Legislation that calls for the implementation of culturally responsive and research-informed solutions that improve police community interactions and prosecutorial decision-making. And so I am so happy to be here to have a conversation on how we can better things for the families of Rayshard Brooks, Daniel Prude, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And so I welcome and introduce our esteemed panels who have joined us for this conversation as we start this dialogue today. And so as you've heard, Ryan Buck, the Vice Chair of the Lansing Community College Board of Trustees, is with us today. He himself drafted a resolution addressing racial injustice through diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it guided its adoption by the Board of Trustees in June 2020. We're also here with Carol Seaman, the Ingham County prosecutor, who has spent years looking at issues involving race, equity, and disproportionate representation of persons of color in Michigan's juvenile and child protection systems. We're also here with Michigan State Senator Curtis Hotel Jr., who serves Ingham County. He is our leader for this region, and we want to hear his vision for addressing the current unrest. And we're also here with Michigan State Representative Sarah Anthony, who was born and raised right here in Lansing and graduated from Everett High School, who currently serves as a Democratic caucus chair for 2019 through 20. Welcome, panel. We're excited to have you here and have this conversation. And so I want to begin our dialogue by reading a statement, and I would like to provide each of you with 3 minutes to respond. And the statement is, please discuss and share information about the current progress of your efforts and experiences in having courageous conversations. By that, I mean ways you have used your power to change policies and potentially laws that have adversely affected those who have experienced inequities and or injustices. And I'll start with Mr. Buck today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Elam, and thank you to our organizers for putting on tonight's event. To your question, I'm very proud to share with you all what Lansing Community College has been doing to address systemic racism, racial injustice. The Board of Trustees is firmly behind our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts as we educate our next generation of nurses, aircraft mechanics, paralegals. LCC is working to institutionalize diversity, equity, inclusion programming at all levels. We have a chief diversity officer, which I can tell you is not common in the country for community colleges. And I think it's crucial that we do have that institutionalization of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, because LCC might be the only place where some of our students will have any in-depth exposure to people who have a different skin color, practice a different religion, or of a different sexual orientation. And it's essential that we're sparking in our students a curiosity to seek out what they do not know, not to fear that unknown, and to really challenge their own bias and acknowledge their privileges. 2 quick examples of what LCC is doing in this area is in 2019, it was the 400th anniversary of our first African slaves being kidnapped and brought to this, what would later become our country. And jumping off from that, LCC decided to observe this anniversary for the entire year of 2019 with programming designed to remember our history of slavery and to acknowledge that history and how it impacts us today. In the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, the Board of Trustees adopted a resolution to address racial injustice through DEI. The resolution is more than words, and it is a call to action that holds our president and our college accountable to truly move the needle. It looks at areas of the role of law enforcement, not only our public safety department, but also our law enforcement training program. Human resources, our training and hiring practices. LCC has more than 1,200 employees, and also equity in not only student success, but student access. The expectation is deep involvement at every level at LCC, so we really institutionalize diversity, equity, and inclusion. The resolution always also provides support or backing or cover to our college leaders to have those difficult or uncomfortable conversations to really address the systemic oppression and injustice. Knowledge leads to empathy, and empathy evolves into action. And I really think LCC is a willing partner in that journey in our community.
Thank you, Trustee Buck. I'd like to allow Representative Anthony to now join the conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and just thank you for allowing me to be here and for having this conversation. I think these conversations are always necessary, but it just feels as though we need to dig in even more. And in our respective places in the vineyard, this is just important for us to be doing. You know, when I look at just my tenure in the legislature, and I'm still a freshman, I just got there, I committed early on to infuse in an equity lens in every single thing that I do. Every bill that I introduce and support, every community initiative needs to be done with a heart of lifting everyone and ensuring that we're not fighting for equality, but equity, right? Because we know that everyone kind of starts off on a different playing field. And so we need to give folks the resources and supports that they need. And so I'm from the college access kind of world. And when we're coaching students for like applying for colleges, sometimes we say, have a reach school, have a safe school, have a couple of options. And so I've tried to introduce bills that are some that I feel like are low hanging fruit when it comes to equity and inclusion. And then some that it's going to take a lot of work, right? It's going to take not just changing hearts and minds, but really digging into the work. So I'll give you a couple of examples of both and what's happening. Some low hanging fruit is things that I think are easy, right? Banning discrimination on the basis of your hair, right? So House Bill 4811, the Crown Act in Michigan, would make it so that regardless of how folks wear their hair, whether it's like Greg DeMeyer's rocking some amazing locks or the curls or the braids, however we show up into places of employment or education, that we cannot be discriminated against, right? Sent home, fired, not given a promotion because of how you wear your hair. And when I've introduced bills like this, I've had folks on both sides of the aisle laugh at me and said that is not a priority. But you tell that to a single mother who shows up to work and told that they need to go home or be fired because they decided to wear their hair curly and have been told that that doesn't fit the mold of the company, right? You tell that to a child in Jackson who was told they couldn't take school pictures because of the braids that were in their hair. So these are real issues that, while they may seem small, have a psychological and economic impact on people, and primarily people of color. I also have introduced low-hanging fruit, like introducing bills related to restrictive covenants. So many of us, if you go home and look at your deed, you may have discriminatory language in that deed that says that if you are an African American, if you're a woman, if you're Jewish, that you cannot own property or live in that neighborhood. Now, we know the Federal Housing Act said that those deeds were discriminatory. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to housing. But many folks don't want to pass along a legacy of discrimination to their kids, right? Most of the folks who have come to me are older white men who say, I don't want to pass on this deed. I have all girls, right? I have daughters. And this deed says that I can't pass this on to them. And I know it's not enforceable, but I don't want to leave a legacy of discrimination to them. So these are some, low-hanging fruit things that I've been introducing and working on, and all of them are stuck in committee, right? There's not a sense of urgency, by and large, in this particular legislature. And I don't want to make this a partisan issue. And I know we're going to talk about having representation at the table, but for me as an African American to try to advocate for these issues, and often, I don't think that there's any chairs of committees right now in the House that are chaired by people of color. And so to have to explain and make the case for equity in that way is hard. And to prove to folks, to prove to my colleagues that these issues matter is a struggle every single day. And then, the big pieces, right? The big policies that we're working on, like education reform, the fact that our urban school districts who need the most, right, get the least, right? The fact that we're still fighting for clean air in places like Detroit, which is the most polluted zip code in the country, right? Clean water. We're still fighting to ensure that the water in Flint is safe for the babies and safe for the families. And so we're still having these big issues that if we just had lawmakers at the top that were looking at these things through an equity lens, not thinking about looking out for the wealthiest or looking out for the majority, but looking at these systems from an equity lens, I think this would be a game changer. Now, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and I know we don't have too much time, but a bright spot in the legislature in my freshman term has been criminal justice reform. Now, whatever lens that we have been able to approach this, some folks have taken it from the moral lens, but we have to be savvy. Some of our Republican colleagues say, look, we got to look at this from the economic lens. This doesn't make financial sense to have so many folks locked up, right? And so this has been a bright spot in the legislature that we have been able to, let's tackle the tough issues that are facing our criminal justice system. Let's get folks out of jail. Let's not incarcerate folks because they can't pay. So I think that is something that we can hang our hat on as some low-hanging fruit that we've been able to work through, both Republicans and Democrats. But we've got a long way to go. And so I ask folks to keep paying attention to this work, because there's a lot more we need to do to, again, ensure that there's an equitable society in our state, not just equality, or we're looking out for the folks who already have enough.
Thank you, Representative Anthony. Senator Hertel, would you like to jump in?
Absolutely. I always love to go after Representative Anthony. She is my favorite member of the House, other than my brother who serves in the House. It's hard when you got family there, but it's hard to go beyond that. But Sarah does an absolutely wonderful job for our community. I grew up with every sort of privilege possible. And I believe very firmly that because of that, my job in the Senate, my job in public service, is to try to end those privileges. It's the only way that this country moves forward, and it's the only way we heal, is to end those. I grew up in the city of Detroit, where if you grew up on one block, you went to a school with barbed wire around it. And if you lived 2 blocks over, you lived in Grosse Pointe, and you had sailing school. I remember driving past all these boats in the water. I said to my dad, what is that? And it was people, part of the school day was learning how to sail. Mm-hmm. Now imagine the juxtaposition of that, just 1 block from each other. So I've spent my entire career trying to end the injustices that are in the world that we have. When I was elected to the Ingham County Commission, we expanded the Ingham Health Plan to provide 16,000 Ingham County residents with basic access to health care. When I was Register of Deeds, we sued every major bank in the country that was trying to illegally take people's homes, literally destroying communities. Much higher numbers in Black and brown communities than anywhere else. Destroying neighborhoods. And so in the legislature, we've tried to continue that same work. Now, it's a struggle on days, and I think Sarah touched on that a little bit. And I don't want to say that everything is partisan, but we introduced legislation to just a simple resolution saying that racism is a public health threat. Now, I don't understand how anyone could look at America and not realize that that's the case. And that resolution, that basic statement, has still not had a hearing in the legislature. And that should tell you where we are. We've had resolutions to declare Dairy Day in Michigan, Craft Beer Day in Michigan, all other kinds of nonsense in Michigan. But we can't take the simple step to say that racism is a public health threat. Now, our governor said it, and I'm proud to work with our governor. This week, obviously, we should all be keeping our governor in our thoughts and prayers, considering what's happened. But she's led the charge to try to change this, trying to change, provide implicit bias training for all police officers, trying to do that in the healthcare field as well. I'd say we have to go a step farther. Implicit bias is not just a problem, it's a symptom. The manifestations of implicit bias in our police and in healthcare and in every other place is just a symptom of a much larger problem, systematic racism in America. And we have to start at a very young age. So those are some of the things I'm proud to work with the governor on. We also introduced a package this week on police reform, which I think is really important in the Senate. We provided some work to allow for social work and better police partnerships with social workers. Too often I think that our police are dealing with issues that they haven't been trained for, and quite frankly aren't equipped to deal with. And so we need more social workers in those situations. We need more mental health diversion training. We need to have a place for sexual misconduct to be reported by police officers. Too often, those kinds of complaints get buried. We need whistleblower and privacy protections for officer complaints. Now, when you make a complaint about a police officer, the last thing you should be worried about is others coming back to attack you afterwards. Obviously, you should be protected in those situations. So this would make it a crime if anyone would tell another police officer who made that complaint. Fraudulent 911 calls. I think that's a huge issue, obviously. And what we want to make it a crime in Michigan that if you call 911 based on a false claim because of someone's race or ethnicity, that you are punished for it. You are wasting public resources, and you are putting that person in danger. And so that is another thing we're working on. And I think that the biggest thing that we have to work on in terms of police reform, and that we're still working on the language of this bill, but if you're a doctor here in Michigan and you violate the public health code, or you violate the law, we take your license away. We don't say you take some time at home. We don't allow you to go be a doctor some other place in the state. We say you no longer are a doctor in Michigan. You violated that public trust. I can't think of a more important public trust than being a police officer. Those people should have the highest level of public trust. And when that trust is violated, they should no longer have a license to work in this state. So we changed the laws last year to try to stop bad cop hopping. That was a good change, because it basically said that we're gonna have a database that if someone's fired from a police force, that they can at least go look and find out what the reason was. The problem is it doesn't say you can't hire them. So you could know about it all you want, but that doesn't mean you can't hire them. So for me, we have to treat police just like we treat every other profession. At this point, if you're a barber and you violate the public health code, you lose your barber's license. If you violate the law, you shouldn't have a license to be a police officer, and that should end. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hertel. And we'll now hear from Prosecutor Seaman.
So I had a lot of notes that I did when Kim first asked me to join this discussion. And I think the things that have happened this week have just really thrown our discussion into a new phase, I think. Certainly the issues of systemic racism, bias, and every aspect that's already been mentioned by Sarah and by Ryan and by Curtis are very real. We know in housing, we know in criminal justice, we know in every aspect, healthcare, that there is racism. And those of us who've been paying attention have known it for a long time. But what has happened in the last few months, there's such a spotlight on it that people who were able to not have it be part of their daily routine said, this is not our America. This is not the world I know. And it's like, yeah, like Curtis Fertel, I grew up as a basically pretty privileged white person. I didn't realize it because I came from a working class background. I grew up here in Lansing. I marched in Civil Rights March in the mid-'60s when I was just a young child. I was a feminist. I, was a supporter of LGBTQ rights. I thought I was pretty damn woke. And, but what I've learned is that we get the privilege of being blind. We can turn it on and off. As a white person, I've had the luxury, and many of my dearest friends who are very kind, aware people have had the luxury of not having to be aware of it. We can just turn it off and choose when we want to know that it's going on. So I've tried to work through my whole life, and being a young assistant prosecutor in the 80s and 90s, I start to really see some of the discrepancies and the disparities. And I love what Sarah said about the difference between equity and equality. We really are looking for equitable treatment, which means treating people proportionately and effectively, not the same. When I came to the prosecutor's office as the elected prosecutor in 2017, I think there was still a view in prosecution as a whole that the best thing was to be colorblind. That, you're supposed to treat everyone the same, and that is equality. And if you don't know the race of who you're charging, prosecuting, obviously when you're in court you do, but that you are making fair decisions. And I think one thing I got to call out Dr. Elam, because I had the pleasure of working with him at Public Policy Associates, and really learned the value of data. If you can't measure something, you really only know anecdotally what's going on. So as a young prosecutor in the 80s and 90s, I learned anecdotally what was going on. I saw patterns that caused me concern about driving while license suspended, or bail bond practices, or the huge numbers of young African-American men who I saw every day in the courtroom that were disproportionately represented in the system, juveniles who I saw their families coming in as abuse and neglect, then juvenile delinquents, then adult criminal offenders. So, you can know that anecdotally, but then I joined the Committee on Juvenile Justice, a statewide organization, and in the early 90s, and started really seeing the role of data. And now I'm really pleased to be part of the Vera Institute of Justice. They have agreed to work with us on two projects, Reshaping Prosecution, and then a brand new project called Motion and Justice. The Reshaping Prosecution is working on mass incarceration issues, and I'm proud to say that in the 3.5 years I've been the prosecutor, we've reduced our prison rate 27%. Over almost 300 people who have not gone to prison who would have probably in the past. But what we don't know is we can't compare people. Say, if we want to look at young African-American men and young Latino men and young white men between the ages 18 and 25 who have a gun, and how do they progress through the system? We can't tell you that now. But as we move through the Motion and Justice project with Vera, we will be able to gather and track that demographic data, and then be able to see where our sticking points in our legal system is. Where are we in Ingham County, and maybe the same as nationally, or maybe different. Where are we creating the hangups? I have a sense that some of them are low-level things like trespass, resisting and obstructing, places people get pulled deeper in the system. But we want to know what the data says. Then we can construct policies and analyze those policies to say, do they work? Because I've put some new policies in place since I've been the prosecutor regarding habitual offenders and supplementation and immigration consequences and resisting and obstructing and treating persons with different sexual orientations with respect and dignity. But always you have to be able to measure, it's great to say I've done this, but did it work? And that's the part that I'm still looking to see. So with my background, having worked in almost every, I worked in all three branches of state government. I drafted legislation. I worked at the State Court Administrative Office. I worked as the Director of Child Welfare Institute for the Department of Health and Human Services. I worked at MSU in the Chance of Childhood program. I've looked at things through a different lens. And so while my background is child welfare and criminal justice, everything that we do, we don't have criminal justice if we don't have jobs, if we don't have transportation, if we don't have equity in other places. So that's been my commitment to bring to my office. And having that conversation initially was a little tough because, we ride a white horse. If you're the prosecutor, you want to think, you're doing the right thing. And so it's hard to say that we had to have implicit bias training, which we started in 2017. I'll talk more about that because my question I have to answer later. But we've had training on a variety of issues. We've also had some very tough conversations. This week, we've had our first training with the Vera Institute. And we have a work group where they are now reaching out to some of you, I think, to say basically, what is the prosecutor's office doing? They've reached out to Truth, Racial Healing, Transformation, the Immigration Refugee Resource Consortium, police chiefs watch judicial hearings, what's really happening. So I'm committed to moving forward. Those conversations are tough. It's really tough to have them with my law enforcement partners because, again, they like to wear the white hat, and they often do in Ingham County. I'm very proud of our law enforcement, but we can always do better. And I have to have an independent role from the police, which is hard as a prosecutor, to say what I'm doing cannot be viewed as just continuing whatever happens in law enforcement. So those are some very difficult but very fruitful conversations we've been having.
Thank you, Prosecutor Seaman, and thank you all for sharing some concrete examples of things that you're actually doing in your role. And so I want to move to our next segment. I would ask that you would limit your questions to 3 minutes each. And I want to start with Trustee Buck again. What is past and prologue? What historic forces have led to the racial divide in 2020 from your perspective? 3 minutes, please.
Okay. At a high level, to me, it's the disagreement out there in America about slavery. After the Civil War, after the assassination of President Lincoln, those who supported slavery found ways to transform it into yet another form of oppression, to keep African Americans down and white Americans up. It was the passage of tough criminal sanctions for minor crimes that were disproportionately targeted towards persons of color. It was Jim Crow laws. It was the writing of school textbooks a certain way so that up-and-coming generations would be taught that the Civil War was about everything but slavery. That there is a disagreement about slavery impacted us throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st. In the 1970s, the phrase law and order was that racist smokescreen for rallying whites at the expense of people of color. Even today, there is a large segment of white Americans that believe that we are living in a post-racial society. The reality is we're living in a white majority society where if one is white, they have the privilege of shutting it off, as Prosecutor Seaman mentioned, shutting off the issue of race, ignoring it, remaining apathetic. I am a gay white man. When I enter the room, many are likely to perceive me as nothing more than a white heterosexual man. There's a lot of privilege there. When a person of color enters a room, implicit bias immediately forms, forcing that person of color to shoulder a burden immediately. The forces that rewrote history for certain segments of the population are the reason we're here tonight, in my opinion. We need to remember our history, acknowledge our differences and celebrate those differences, I mean, that is diversity, and there's incredible power and unity in that.
Thank you so much. This next question is for Prosecutor Seaman. Is there even such a thing as systemic racism? Some people argue that the idea makes no sense. What do you think?
Well, there's no question. I mean, so for me, that's like, I have to say, I almost laugh because, you know, despite what some people are still promoting, there's no question in my mind. And, you know, you can have good people acting in good faith who think they're trying to do the right thing. And we're part of institutions that, as Ryan said, are built on a history of racism. There's nothing in the US that is not built on that. The criminal justice system, our housing, everything is built on that. And you have really good people, and we've done our best to work within those frameworks. But the frameworks themselves have a systemic racist flavor. So, you know, we do our cultural diversity training and our implicit bias training, and we do enact new policies, but we really have to deep down to the foundation of what's going on. And that's very hard because, as I mentioned before, you know, we're all talked about, it's very hard to look at yourself and say, I've been part of something that's really bad. I can look back at things I did in the 80s and 90s in good faith, you know, following the law that had bad consequences. I came to terms very early as an elected prosecutor with juvenile life without parole, and immediately had our individuals resentenced to terms of life, terms of years as opposed to life without parole. And one of the young men that was resentenced, who by the way is off parole now, was someone I had waived to adult court when I was a young assistant prosecutor. So the seeing that people age out of crime, that we need to keep our eyes open and learn constantly about our history and assumptions that we make. Assumptions we made about women and voting, about the intellectual capacity of African Americans, that we're just dead wrong sometimes. And we have to be open-minded and say, goes back to our first question, comfortable with that difficult conversation. So yes, there's no doubt in my mind we have systemic racism. If we deny it, then we can't address it. We have to acknowledge it so that we can really look at those foundational pieces and try to address each of those pieces.
Thank you so much. Representative Anthony, why is it important to have those of color at the table where decisions are being made?
Thank you. And thank you for bearing with me. I had to shift rooms because somebody texted me and said like I was in the basement or in a closet. I was so dark. So just know that that's what that was. So thanks for the grace. I'll say three things about kind of this proverbial seat at the table, right? Which comes from my shero, Shirley Chisholm. Everybody knows that's my inspiration. You know, I do think that there's something so important about having people of color lifting up their own issues at the table in the halls of power. I love having allies and thoughtful folks from all walks of life that are able to uplift the issues of, you know, Black and brown folks. But there's something about sharing your lived experience and also being on the school board as a prosecutor, in the legislature, as president. There's something special about actually being at the table and lifting up your own experiences. And so I think that I always am someone that's advocating for more seats for Black and brown folks at these tables. It's important. The second thing I'll note though, and this is something that we don't talk about often, and you know, in quiet corners, we say, you know, all skin folks ain't kin folks, which meaning that many times we will expand the table and get more Black and brown folks at the table, and then they do not uplift the voices of Black and brown folks. In fact, they do more damage when they get to the table. They laugh at the racist jokes. They actually take the money from lobbyists that are trying to oppress us. They are used as tools and as foils for individuals who are intentionally trying to damage to our communities. And so it's not enough to just say, well, there's a Latinx person or an African American who we elected to these tables. We have to hold folks accountable to uplifting our issues, you know, because I tell you, it happens more often than you think. that people we have empowered to be as elected officials, that we think that are fighting for us and representing us, are not doing so. The third thing I'll say about folks being at the table is that once we are there, and I will tell you, my record shows, and I'll continue to fight for these issues of equity and inclusion, but we need folks like the folks who are on this call to show up and have our back when we're there. You know, the issues that we're fighting for are not easy. They take a lot of water to carry. They take a lot of political savvy. And so it's not just enough to elect folks. We have to hold them accountable and make sure that we're supporting elected officials, including those of color. That's writing letters when we know they're fighting for issues. That's, you know, supporting their campaigns and making sure that we're actually empowering them as they're doing the work on our behalf.
Thank you so much. And this last question is for Senator Hertel. What is being done to address implicit bias in your areas of involvement and influence at this time?
So, you know, on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered. And for a moment, a small moment, implicit bias training became a bipartisan issue. And in June, the Senate unanimously, we don't pass a whole lot of bills unanimously, especially when they have to do with social justice, through the Michigan Senate. And Senate Bill 945, which I was a co-sponsor of, passed that we would improve police training by requiring continuing education for all officers in implicit bias training, violence de-escalation techniques, and mental health screening. That bill, even though it passed unanimously in the Senate, still is awaiting action in the House.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, the bill doesn't go far enough, because implicit bias training shouldn't just be for police officers. That's the symptom of a much larger problem that we have to deal with. But what happened between the day it was passed and now today, where the House isn't taking that bill up? If you ask me, one of the biggest things that happened was a president of the United States ending all diversity training for all federal workers, making diversity training, making bias training a partisan issue, saying that it was un-American to have bias training in America. Now, I love my country, but I love my country like a kid loves their adult parents. You see their flaws. Sometimes I think that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle love their country like a child loves their parent, where it's all reverence, but you don't actually see what's actually going on underneath. The only way to actually solve America's problems is to actually acknowledge that they exist. And so I don't want to be overly partisan, but they've made it partisan. And that's unfortunate, because we don't move forward unless we acknowledge these things about ourselves, these truths about ourselves. I am 100% sure that I have implicit biases, unknown largely. You know, I get people on my coffee hours after the governor talked about implicit biases that say, well, I'm not a racist. That's not, first of all, there's a difference between hard racism and soft racism. But you don't know the biases that you have inside of you. It's impossible to know those things until you've actually gone through the process of trying to change them. And so for me, the most important thing that we can do is to change the legislature, because if they're not going to take up such a simple bill, just a simple question of should we provide basic bias training for police officers, knowing what's happened in this country. If you're unwilling to do that, then I don't have any use for you. And so my goal over the next few weeks is to make sure that Sarah Anthony is in the majority next term. I'm not going to get there in the Senate, unfortunately. I'm in my last term, and we got close. We got it's a lot different than it was last term. But we got to change. We have to change who's at the table, and we got to change who's at the head of the table, because the person at the head of the table is the one that's actually preventing these things from changing in Michigan and America.
Thank you so much, Senator. We are doing great on time. I think our goal is to wrap this up in about 30 minutes. And so I'm going to move into another segment here, and I'm going to open it up for either one of you to respond to each question, and we'll see how much time we have and then move on to our final question. But my first question here is, in your own way, can you discuss the recent killings, protests, and their impact on the upcoming election? Floor is open for anyone who'd like to respond to that.
Well, I can just start and say this. So on April 30th, when several of us were in the Capitol building, in which armed gunmen to intimidate us, incite fear, probably one of the worst days of my life. And every single day that I step into that Capitol building, because of the inaction of the Republican leadership and the inaction of the Capitol Commission to ban guns in the Capitol building, I no longer feel safe in that building. I don't encourage people to go into the building. I don't encourage school children to tour the building. And, you know, there have been different lenses in which we've talked about these protests. And I think this is an important distinction, because there is a stark difference between the large protests of NAACP members with our youth and college divisions across the state that uplifted their voices on the Capitol steps and wanted the knee off of their necks and wanted to uplift the issues of social justice, and the domestic terrorists who have been constantly going into the Capitol building and outside of the Capitol to incite fear and hatred. And so at the backdrop of all of this unrest, we have a president who continues to fan the flames of hatred and signal to fringe groups to be violent, and continues to divide us in ways that we don't need to be divided. And so, you know, he has also made it a point to discredit our election system, to incite division, incite distrust and mistrust into our voting. And it's just wrong. And so the thing that I think we have, our tool, you know, I always look at what tools do I have in my toolbox, right? I have my platform, I have my voice. We all have a platform. And I always tell people, if you know, they can, the president can talk about that he's not going to accept the election results. Well, if it's a blowout, right? I used to kind of play sports, at least try to play sports. If it's a blowout, there's no question, right? And so I don't think this is a partisan topic or a partisan forum, but the tool we have collectively is our vote. If you are okay with the way that our country is going, the conditions of your community, the way your school, the kids' school works, your job opportunities, if you're okay the way this pandemic has played out, if you think everything is fine and that you can just kind of rest on your laurels, then fine, stay home. But I don't think anyone in earnest can actually say that. And so I think that if we're not seeing why it's important to lift up your voice, if now is not the time for us to vote, I really don't know what else needs to happen, right? And so that's what we have. And we continue to see that the folks at the top are not looking out for us. And so we have to make sure to lift up our voice in that way.
So if I can jump in, I just today was having conversations with law enforcement, the AG's office. I've been engaged in national conversations with other prosecutors about voter protection, about the integrity of the election. You know, I'm a Democrat, I'm a partisan candidate, but it should not be a partisan issue. This is about making sure that people do have the right to vote, that votes are counted, that they are not excluded, like in the state of Georgia, where voting registrations were purged, that you shouldn't, because you live in Ingham County, where we have terrific clerks and people who are looking out for our system, that our vote shouldn't count more. It should count equally, but it shouldn't count more. That if you're in Detroit, where you have hardly any drop boxes, or, you know, where we're real seriously worried about voter intimidation, it's really scary to have conversations with law enforcement and people on the prosecution end about what do we do if armed people come to intimidate voters? What do we do if there's an armed insurrection after Biden wins, assuming he wins, and there's not a commitment to peaceful transfer of power? These are real issues, and everyone, I think, is pretty shaken up, or almost everyone. But we have to take methodical steps. So the clerks are going to do one thing, the legislators are going to do one thing. As a person who works in law enforcement, I'm partnering with the other people, the Secretary of State, the AG, and the police, who can try to do our piece. I think we have to have that groundswell. We have to make it a blowout, as Representative Anthony said.
So I would say, one election doesn't change America, who America is. So electing President Obama didn't make us not a racist country. And electing Donald Trump didn't make us a racist country. It certainly maybe pointed out that we were a racist country, but it didn't change who we were. I do believe fundamentally at this point that after everything we've seen, to have a commander-in-chief who sees the world in a way that there are people marching with tiki torches through Charlottesville saying awful anti-Semitic and awful racist things, and says that there are fine people there, and sees young men kneeling at a football game and calls them sons of bitches. And I apologize for swearing, but I'm only quoting the president. To allow that to remain, to allow someone who sees the worst in America and tries to exploit it over and over again, and tries to divide us in who we are. There's an old saying, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. If America is fooled again, if America allows it to happen again, I think it does fundamentally change who we are. We have always been a severely imperfect country. We were built on imperfection. We were built on a idea that was completely flawed at the very, very start of it, but we always move towards progress. The moral arc of the world has always moved towards justice, and we cannot allow this to continue. So there was police brutality happening before Donald Trump was president. So I think the question was will the murders that have happened change this election? I don't know if it's the murders themselves that will change it. I think it is a president whose response is to not bring us together, not try to solve the problems, but try to make them worse. If that doesn't change our election, then we may not be the country that we think we are.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Buck, Trustee Buck, did you want to chime in before I move to the next question?
Just a real quick point with the killings, the protests, and how they're impacting the election. What I have noticed, and it's just incredible, is the spin that the different camps are placing on them. Democrats or left of center describe them as a search for justice for those who were killed and address systemic racial injustices in America. Republicans or those right of center describe it as riots in America, and therefore underscoring a need for law and order. We pick and choose what we want to see and hear nowadays, and I think that's just ignorance incarnate.
Well, that's a great segue into my next question, because I would like you all to comment. What do you think the role of mainstream media framing is around current narratives in terms of our news media, our social media, and even Hollywood and movies?
Well, Dr. Lamb, if I could continue on that, based off that question, then it amazes me that mainstream media like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, how they can take one factoid and turn it into a news alert. That is news alert, all caps with an exclamation point. and then turn to a panel of 12 correspondents to pick away at every angle, perspective, gripe every syllable. I think it's an unfortunate result of the 24-hour news cycle. There's no time to gather facts, analyze them, and present them in a, as Fox News says, a fair and balanced way. Because by the time that they would, it's old news then. This allows interest-focused news outfits to only portray news to meet their audience's expectations. I mean, Fox News's business model is to appeal to the conservative bent of the country. There's no financial incentive to put content that does not serve that to underscore those beliefs that their viewers are looking for. And it's not just Fox News that does it. It's other news outfits as well.
You know, so media has changed a lot again since I was a young assistant prosecutor. I'm the oldest one here, I think. So it's you know, it's clickbait. It's you know, with journalists losing their jobs, the whole profession has changed dramatically, and some people don't deserve the name journalist anymore. I think we've seen. So it's very hard, as Ryan said. You know, we have this really quick news cycle, and it's created a discussion that is so polarizing. You know, you have to have yes or no, bad or good, and it makes it hard. And I'm a talker, and I like to think about things a lot. And when I talk with the media, I appreciate, like today, I actually had about an hour conversation with Kara Berg about the Brady disclosures for police officer malfeasance to defense attorneys. And we had a long conversation. Those are hard to have these days. It's very useful to be able to give background, to give nuance, to be able to give history, to be able to give perspective, and actually encourage them to get diverse opinions. So it's dismaying that I don't actually have a television, haven't in a couple of years now. And part of it is because I got so frustrated with watching how the media portrays. But even, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post and, you know, the best journalism, there's still such a framing of the issue that it's very hard to feel that you get a complete picture without reading, you know, 6 or 7 different news articles about the same topic. And that's troubling, and it does make it very hard. Yesterday with what happened with Gretchen Whitmer, I mean, what a clickbait issue that was, and how quickly that, you know, went around the world, but with different perspectives being offered. And as somebody who doesn't work in the Capitol, but works 2 blocks from the Capitol, I've seen the demonstrations, and I've wanted to actually prosecute people who were doing things that I didn't have warrant requests brought to me, so I couldn't. So it's we don't know what the truth is unless people give us, you know, really actually telling the truth.
I think for some, they would say that the media and movies and all those things are a reflection of who we are. I think that it's more a reflection of who's in power of those individual things, how they see the world as it is. And that's very, very different. When you have most people who own media companies, who make movies, who decide what's news, look like me, then obviously that news itself has an implicit bias to it, because and those movies and everything else has an implicit bias to it, because the content is being created by only one group of people. Now, obviously that's changed somewhat. The world's gotten smaller, and the internet and podcasts and all those things have allowed us to get more information out there. But unfortunately has allowed also people to put out completely false and hateful things easier, and for hate groups to find each other, and for awful, awful lies to be spread over and over and over again. So it's gotten better in some ways. But again, I think we all have to remember that the media is not a reflection of what's happening in America. It's a reflection of what people who look a certain way see as a reflection of America. And I think there's a big difference between those two things.
Senator Hertel, do you have to leave us at 8 o'clock as planned?
I can stick around for a little longer.
Okay, we're going to try to wrap it up right after Representative Anthony speaks, and so we'll try to do our best to keep you here to the end.
I was just going to say amen to what everyone said. And I think just putting a finer point on Senator Hertel's comments, I think this is just like a commercial for me to say that we need more Black folks behind the camera as producers. And we also need to empower and uplift Black journalism, right? From the local level, the state level, and the national level, right? The fact that we, in many ways, cannot tell our authentic stories, our perspectives. I'll give you an example. When was the last time that you saw any of the protests covered on CNN or Fox or MSNBC? Now, it's not that they're not happening, right? The work is still happening in corners all across this nation. The media has just decided that there's other things that are sexier and other things that are hotter and other things that they want to focus on. And so, but if we had platforms to tell our own stories, to uplift our own voices, to tell of our own victories, our own defeats, what we're struggling with, what we need. I think the finer thing, if anyone hasn't already watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, watch that. It will freak you out. And it will show you that we are in our own echo chambers and it's really hard to get out of them. I challenge anyone to try to find a perspective that is different than your own. It is by design that it is very hard to do. To actually critically think for yourself, to have an independent thought in 2020 is very difficult. You got to kind of search for it. You've got to hunt for a different perspective to be an independent thinker. And so I think those are some things that are really hard and very challenging, but it's also by design. So we've got a lot of work to do in that front.
I want to mention one book real quickly. I just read about a month ago, Dog Whistle Politics. It's not a new book. It's I don't know, 8 or 10 years old, but it talks about this whole media framing, this, we say something that talk about the riots, the words you use and the connotations those create are definitely intentional.
Yeah, we want to thank you all for sharing your perspectives tonight. The chat has been blowing up with many of the comments that you've made, but we're out of time. And what I want to do is give each of you a minute, if possible, to respond to this final opportunity here. And so what we want to do is talk about the future. And so what positive message can you share with everyone who's assembled themselves tonight about the future race and the organizations, businesses, about employing unrepresented employees of color in positions where decisions are being made? What would be your recommendation as we move forward to the future?
Well, I could start. I believe it's forums like this, conversations in the workplace and at home, events in the community, accurate teaching in our education institutions. These are where the calls to action can be made in the fight for racial justice. The key is to continue the conversation and never let up. It has to be intentional. Otherwise, what has become the norm will continue. I'm going to use the last of my time just to say it is a moral imperative that each one of you watching, if you're eligible to register to vote, please do so. And you can even register on election day. Vote in this election and every election, and vote for candidates that advocate truly for diversity, equity, inclusion, not for those who only play at lip service, like Representative Anthony mentioned, or those who advocate against it. When I think about voting, one of my favorite quotes from the TV show The West Wing pops up in my mind. Decisions are made by those who show up. So I ask you all to show up and vote, and preferably vote by absentee. Thank you so much for having me this evening.
So I want to thank everyone for participating and for giving me the chance, a little unique voice here. I just want to say, because it's really, I've been stretching my brain to think of optimism. There are reasons to be optimistic, even in the middle of this absolute craziness. Having the attention, I'm hoping it's the darkest before the dawn. I want to leave something that I learned years ago working in the child welfare system. And, I'm a slow learner sometimes, but it was when youth aging out of foster care or juvenile justice system, they started a mantra that now it's being used by returning citizens, people coming back from prison into the community, all kinds of different individuals who are saying nothing about us without us. And I think that's really important for those of us as policymakers and legislators to remember that it is the voices of the children, it's the voices of people who've been incarcerated, it's the voices of people who are being evicted, people who are having those day-to-day issues that we always need to make sure, as you know, that we have them at the table, that we as decision makers, policymakers, legislators, that we're always remembering that that we have to hear that voice, nothing about us without us.
I'll go next because I would like to give my friend Sarah Anthony the last word, if that's okay. You know, I am optimistic. I have 4 kids, so I think you have to be optimistic when you have 4 children. And so if we're looking for an upside of our current, an upside of the Trump presidency, and that's hard, I understand. But it has, I think, brought many of us together in a way that wasn't happening before. It has brought action out that wasn't happening before. I think that there were many people who felt safe in America because they just believed that America had changed. You know, a lot of white people just didn't believe we were a racist country. They didn't believe that that racism still exists, and we elected a black man president, so racism must have gone away. And I think it's woken us up that while we have come very far, there is still a whole lot of work to do. And my inspiration comes from the young people that are marching, the young people that are peaceful protesting, the young people that are going out and saying, this is not the country that I will live in, and are going out and fighting to change the world that they are. If that is to me the greatest amount of inspiration we have, because they're not going to put up with it. They're not going to put up with the world that many of us have lived in. And I think that because of that, they'll change the world. So that is my inspiration.
And we'll end with Representative Anthony. Take it away.
This has been a cool way to spend a Friday night. I was texting Senator Hertel, like, this is better than date night, right? Like this is fine. This is good. So thank you for having me. You know, the past few months, we have seen these big waves, right? We have seen this renewed energy. Do you remember in the summer when your timeline was full of, you know, folks, you know, Prosecutor Seaman, everyone was woke, right? Everybody. And, you know, we had everyone from the NFL to NASCAR. We had all these corporations and folks who just came out of the woodwork and declared that Black Lives Matter. They would think differently. All the diversity inclusion folks got contracts, and every local government declared racism as a public health crisis. And my fear is that we are losing momentum. And my fear is that we are talking the talk, but we are slowly stopping on the walking the walk. Mm-hmm. And this is going to take sustained commitment. This will not change overnight. This will not be an issue of just the hearts and minds. We are going to have to stay in this, and it's going to be really hard. But I think that the goal for each of us, and I have challenged everyone on every single Zoom call and meeting that I have been on, to look at what you have done personally in your workplace, at your church, in the state capitol, sure that these issues don't fall by the wayside. Because again, we know the media will move on, but in order for this to actually be different, for this time to actually not be a fleeting moment, we have to personally commit to making sure it's different. And so I look forward to having a check-in in the next 6 months. I want to come back here in this group and for us to have these courageous conversations and look back at this time and say, how did we personally not only commit to doing things different, but actually, how did we do things differently? So I'm excited to see the results of us walking the walk in the next few months and the years to come. Thank you again.
I want to thank each of you for taking the time to come out today. Trustee Buck, Prosecutor Seaman, Senator Hertel, and Representative Anthony, for your leadership, for your comments, and just for showing up tonight and speaking up and acknowledging that things are not right, they're not fair, and they're not just, and working to collectively do something about it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Kim and Yvonne to close us out for this evening.
My apologies, I was on mute and I was in the moment quite a bit here. Sarah, you stole my thunder. One of the things that I was going to say is what my mother always told me: don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And in order for us to do that, I believe that we have to come together in groups like this collectively, regardless if we are gay, if we're straight, if we're black, if we're white, if we're green with blue polka dots. It doesn't matter. This is a collective issue. This is race and equity. This is implicit bias. These are things that have been swept under the carpet for a significant amount of time. And now they're on top. You know, we had Breonna, we had George, and now everything is on. I can't breathe and all of this going on. Well, we still can't breathe. And until we come together in these collective efforts, we won't be able to breathe. And so I am very thankful to each of you for coming out and sharing your hearts. That's what I felt when each of you were talking. It wasn't just a political talk. It was you sharing your heart about how we need to change things that are happening educationally and socially and economically right here in Ingham County and Lansing, Michigan. So, and in Michigan, period. So hats off to each of you. Kim?
I just want to end. I think everything was phenomenal. Thank everyone. Again, there's not enough thank yous in the dictionary because when you appeared tonight, there were so many people that said, oh my God, they're going to appear. I said, sometimes I think people forget that you work for the people. And tonight you have shown just that. You work for the people. And so I think one of the things that was said, we frame our own questions. We frame our own narrative, and we decide what is going to be communicated to the public. That's where I stand. And so tonight, with you all doing that, my heart and my mind is full, and I do not want to belay the time, but I do want to, again, thank you all, especially Dr. Elam. He was behind all of this, say it or not. And so he said, what do I need to do? And he rolled his sleeves up and did it. And Ryan also. Ryan helped form some of the questions, helped lead. There's no way this was not done by one person. This was a collective body of people, and that's what it's going to take. And so, again, before we sign off, I do want to thank everyone. Again, there's no way that things can happen like this for free. And so I do want to thank some of the people, the individual donors who were donated towards the Tonight Show, William Crenshaw, Nora Smith, Kiana Watson, Kelly Rankin, Jamie Jones, Princess Morgan, Bishop and Mother Milton, and so all the other ones who prayed and kept us up. And like I said, this is a series. It's called Good Trouble, and I just want to give credit because Dr. Paul Elam is the one that named this, so he can get the credit for that. Good Trouble, and so that's what the series is going to. We're going to be doing more, and like you said, Sarah, we're going to have you back. We're going to have you back. So again, thank you all for being here, and we would be remiss if we did not close with prayer. Because again, none of this can be done without him above. And so Greg, if you can just end with prayer. You're on mute.
The Lord heard me. The Lord heard me. Dear Heavenly Gracious Father, Lord, we thank you, Lord, for this day. We thank you, Lord, for how you've allowed us to come on this platform, God, to speak our minds and our hearts and to give people a sense that we are still trying to fight and we're still trying to make things happen in a positive manner. God, we ask you, Lord, that as we get off of this platform, that we don't lose momentum, that we gain the momentum, God, that we still continue to do what you've called us to do and live in equality. In the mighty name of Jesus, we praise you in Jesus' name. Thank God. Amen.
Amen.
You all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.